One man, one decision, a sealed fate. Pontius Pilate, powerful Roman governor who washed his hands of Christ's blood. But what happened next? The untold story of the man who condemned the Son of God. Nightmares, guilt, downfall, disgrace. Earthly power is fleeting, but some choices are eternal. Discover the shocking truth about the dark fate of Pontius Pilate after the crucifixion. A trial that changed history, a decision that haunted him to the end. Divine justice reaches everyone, even those who try to wash their hands. The dark fate of Pontius Pilate after the crucifixion. A story of power, cowardice, and the inevitable consequences of our choices. Pontius Pilate, a name that echoes through the centuries, wasn't just a biblical figure but a real man whose decisions shaped human history. As the fifth Roman governor of Judea, Pilate served under Emperor Tiberius between 26 and 36 AD, during a time of great political and religious turmoil. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be in his shoes, governing such a volatile and complex region? Historical records about Pilate go beyond the biblical Gospels. Historians like Flavius Josephus and Philo of Alexandria documented his administration, often marked by conflicts with the local Jewish population. Josephus describes him as inflexible and sometimes cruel in his decisions, while Philo portrays him as corrupt and provocative. These descriptions help us understand the man behind the myth, revealing his complexities and contradictions. Archaeology has also confirmed Pilate's historical existence. In 1961, an inscription known as the Pilate Stone was discovered in Caesarea Maritima, mentioning him as prefect of Judea. This extraordinary find directly connects the biblical narrative with secular history, proving that Pilate was not just a literary figure, but a real Roman administrator with power over life and death. So Pilate's position was extremely delicate. He needed to maintain peace in a troublesome province while representing Rome's interests. Imagine the challenge of governing a people with deeply rooted religious traditions, so different from Roman practices, and with a strong desire for independence. This constant tension between pleasing his superiors in Rome and avoiding local revolts set the perfect stage for the moral dilemma he would face when judging Jesus of Nazareth. When Jesus was brought before Pilate, the Roman governor found himself in one of history's deepest moral and political dilemmas. The Gospels report that Pilate found no crime in Jesus that warranted the death penalty, repeatedly declaring, "I find no fault in him." Can you imagine the pressure he felt at that moment, torn between justice and political convenience? This internal conflict reveals much about how power can place us in situations where our convictions are tested. The Jewish religious authorities, led by the Sanhedrin, pressured for a conviction, accusing Jesus of blasphemy and proclaiming himself king, a charge of sedition against Rome. Pilate was aware that these accusations were motivated more by envy and internal religious disputes than by any real threat to Roman authority. However, the growing and agitated crowd represented a risk of revolt that could cost him his position or even his life if it reached the emperor's ears. The famous gesture of washing hands, reported in the Gospel of Matthew, has become a universal symbol of attempting to evade responsibility. "I am innocent of this just man's blood," Pilate declared, in a desperate attempt to shift moral guilt to the Jewish leaders and the crowd clamoring for crucifixion. But can we really absolve ourselves of responsibility for our decisions with a simple symbolic gesture? This question continues to challenge us in our own lives today. Pilate's final decision reveals how we often choose the path of least resistance when facing social pressure or fear of personal consequences. He yielded not because he believed in Jesus' guilt, but because he feared an insurrection that would tarnish his reputation before Rome. How many times in our own journey do we compromise our deepest values out of fear of the consequences of standing up for them? Pilate's dilemma is, in many ways, a mirror of our own moral conflicts. Before giving in to pressure, Pilate made several attempts to avoid Jesus' crucifixion, showing his reluctance to condemn a man he considered innocent. One strategy was to use the Jewish Passover custom, where the Romans would release a prisoner as a goodwill gesture. He offered the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, a notorious criminal, surely hoping they would choose to free Jesus. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be in that crowd, having to make that fateful choice? When this strategy failed and the crowd chose Barabbas, Pilate resorted to another tactic. He ordered Jesus to be flogged, hoping this severe but non-lethal punishment would satisfy the accuser's thirst for blood. Roman flogging was extremely brutal, using a whip with metal or bone tips that tore the flesh. Pilate calculated that seeing Jesus bloodied and humiliated would satisfy the crowd, and they would relent in demanding his death. His miscalculation reveals how we often underestimate the depth of human hatred and prejudice. The Gospels also report that Pilate sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, ruler of Galilee, who was in Jerusalem for Passover, in an attempt to transfer the responsibility of judgment. Since Jesus was Galilean, Pilate saw an opportunity to rid himself of the case and avoid making a tough decision. This political maneuver shows how we often try to pass on our most challenging problems, especially when they involve morally complex decisions. Each of Pilate's failed attempts illustrates a common pattern in our own lives. When pressured to compromise our values, we often seek middle solutions or try to delegate responsibility before finally giving in. What could we learn from Pilate's failures? Perhaps that half measures rarely work when fundamental principles are at stake, and moral courage often requires facing difficult personal consequences. Jesus' trial occurred during Passover, an extremely sensitive time in Jerusalem when the city was buzzing with Jewish pilgrims from all over the ancient world. During this festival celebrating the Jews' liberation from slavery in Egypt, nationalist sentiment was at its peak, and any spark could ignite a revolt against Roman occupation. Can you imagine the electrifying atmosphere of a crowded city, where memories of past liberation fueled dreams of future independence? Pilate already had a problematic history of dealing with Jewish religious sensitivities. On previous occasions, he had provoked riots by introducing standards with the emperor's images in Jerusalem and using sacred temple funds to build an aqueduct. These incidents had resulted in violent protests and deaths, tarnishing his reputation both among the Jews and with his superiors in Rome. The case of Jesus, therefore, arose in a context where Pilate could not afford another political mistake. The province of Judea was considered one of the hardest to govern in the Roman Empire due to Jewish monotheism, which rejected the worship of the emperor and Roman deities. While other provinces integrated more easily into the Roman system, the Jews maintained a distinct religious and cultural identity that often clashed with imperial practices. This Jewish exceptionalism created a constant challenge for administrators like Pilate, who needed to balance Rome's demands with local realities. Pilate's power, though considerable, was constantly under scrutiny by his superiors, especially Lucius Vitellius, the legate of Syria, who had authority over him. Any major disturbance in Jerusalem could result in his removal from office or worse. This political reality helps explain why Pilate, even recognizing Jesus' innocence, chose the path of political stability over justice. How many times in our own lives do we let the fear of consequences stop us from standing up for what we know is right? In the midst of the trial's chaos, a surprising and mysterious element emerges in the narrative: the intervention of Pilate's wife. The Gospel of Matthew reports that while Pilate was sitting in court, his wife sent him an urgent message. "Have nothing to do with that righteous man, for I have suffered much because of him today in a dream." This female figure, traditionally called Claudia Procula, introduces a supernatural and prophetic dimension to the unfolding drama. Have you ever had a dream so vivid it felt like a divine warning? Procula's intervention is particularly notable because Roman women generally did not involve themselves in public political or judicial matters. The fact that she felt compelled to send a message during an official trial suggests the intensity of her experience and her conviction in Jesus' innocence. This moment humanizes Pilate, showing him not just as a Roman official, but as a man with personal relationships and family influences weighing on his decisions. In later Christian traditions, Procula is often revered as one of the first non-Jews to recognize Jesus' divinity. The Orthodox Church even canonized her as a saint, celebrating her feast on October 27th. Her dream is interpreted as a divine intervention, a final heavenly warning to Pilate to avoid the terrible mistake he was about to make. This tradition reminds us that wisdom and spiritual discernment often come through unexpected paths and from people who might not typically have a voice. Procula's ignored warning also represents the many missed opportunities we have to change the course of our actions. How often in our own lives do we ignore warnings, intuitions, or wise advice that could save us from disastrous decisions? Procula's message remains a powerful reminder that truth often tries to reach us through unexpected channels, and our willingness to listen can make all the difference between choices that bring peace or torment. When Pilate finally gave in to pressure and pronounced the sentence against Jesus, he probably didn't imagine the eternal impact his decision would have. Crucifixion, a Roman method of execution reserved for the worst criminals, was deliberately brutal and humiliating, designed not only to kill, but to degrade and serve as a public warning. By authorizing this fate for a man he himself declared innocent, Pilate crossed a moral line from which he could never return. Can you imagine the weight of knowing you condemned an innocent man to the most terrible death known at the time? The Gospels report details suggesting Pilate's unease even after the sentence. He insisted on the inscription, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," on the cross, despite protests from religious leaders who wanted it to read, "This man claimed to be King of the Jews." This small resistance may reflect both his irritation with Jewish leaders and a subconscious acknowledgement of Jesus' true identity. The words we choose, even in moments of weakness, often reveal deeper truths about our convictions. When Jesus died, extraordinary phenomena occurred. Darkness covered the land, the temple veil was torn, and there was an earthquake. The Roman centurion present exclaimed, "Truly this man was the Son of God." Although the Gospels do not mention Pilate's reaction to these events, it's hard to imagine he wasn't deeply affected by these cosmic signs that seemed to confirm the injustice of his decision. Often, the consequences of our wrong choices manifest in ways we cannot ignore. Later, Christian tradition suggests that Pilate never found peace after the crucifixion. Tormented by guilt and remorse, he would have carried the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. This narrative of inner torment reminds us that our moral choices have consequences not only externally, but also for our own conscience and spiritual well-being. Pilate's story invites us to reflect. What decisions are we making today that could haunt us tomorrow? What moral compromises are we making that might cost us our inner peace? The days and months following Jesus' crucifixion were marked by growing unrest for Pilate. Apocryphal accounts and early Christian traditions suggest he began experiencing recurring nightmares and a constant sense of guilt consuming him from within. The man who once washed his hands to symbolically rid himself of responsibility found that no water could cleanse his stained conscience. Have you ever felt the overwhelming weight of remorse for a decision that can't be undone? The rise of early Christianity in Jerusalem must have been particularly unsettling for Pilate. Seeing Jesus' followers grow in number, openly preaching about his resurrection and calling him the Son of God, would be a constant reminder of his terrible error in judgment. Each new convert, Each miracle attributed to the apostles, each testimony of the resurrection was like a silent accusation against the man who authorized the crucifixion of their master. Some Christian traditions, particularly in the Coptic and Ethiopian churches, suggest that Pilate eventually converted to Christianity, seeking redemption for his act. Apocryphal documents like the Gospel of Nicodemus and the Acts of Pilate portray a repentant Pilate who acknowledges Jesus as the true Son of God. Though historically questionable, these narratives capture a deep psychological truth: the universal human desire to find redemption even after our worst mistakes. Pilate's spiritual fate remains one of the great mysteries of Christian history. His decision to condemn Jesus to death, despite recognizing his innocence, places him among the most tragic figures of Scripture. A man who had a personal encounter with the truth incarnate, but chose political convenience. His story challenges us to consider: when truth and convenience conflict in our own lives, which path do we choose? And are we prepared to live with the eternal consequences of those choices? When the guards at Jesus' tomb returned with reports of an earthquake, a radiant angel, and an empty tomb, Pilate faced a new crisis. The Gospel of Matthew reports that the religious leaders, in panic, met with the elders and devised a plan to bribe the soldiers, instructing them to say the disciples had stolen the body while they slept. As the Roman governor, Pilate would have been informed of this situation and likely participated in the attempt to cover up the extraordinary events that occurred that Sunday morning. For a pragmatic Roman administrator like Pilate, the idea of resurrection was absurd and potentially dangerous. Jesus' resurrection would validate his teachings and claim to divinity, directly undermining Roman authority and potentially inciting revolts. Moreover, if news that a man he condemned to death had returned to life reached Rome, his already compromised political position would be completely destroyed. Fear and pride often lead us to deny truths that threaten our worldview or position. And the soldiers guarding the tomb were under Roman authority and thus under Pilate's command. The fact that they were not punished for allowing the body to disappear, a capital offense in the Roman army, strongly suggests Pilate's complicity in the cover-up. Imagine this man's dilemma. After crucifying an innocent, he now found himself trying to suppress evidence of a miracle confirming everything Jesus had proclaimed. How often in our own lives do we continue to build lies to protect past wrong decisions? Despite these efforts, news of the resurrection spread rapidly and the Christian movement flourished. Pilate's attempt to control the narrative completely failed, demonstrating how truth has a power that transcends human manipulations. Today, 2,000 years later, billions of people worldwide celebrate the resurrection Pilate tried to deny. This reality invites us to reflect. What truths are we trying to suppress in our own lives? And can we really expect to succeed where even the power of Rome failed? The decline of Pilate's career began a few years after Jesus' crucifixion. In 36 AD, he ordered a violent crackdown on a group of Samaritans gathered at Mount Gerizim, resulting in many deaths. This excessive action led to complaints to his superior, Lucius Vitellius, governor of Syria, who ordered Pilate to return to Rome to explain his actions to Emperor Tiberius. Can you imagine the humiliation of this powerful man, now summoned like a disobedient servant to account for himself? When Pilate arrived in Rome, he found that Emperor Tiberius had died, and Caligula was now on the imperial throne. Historical sources are scarce on what happened next, but we know Pilate never returned to his post in Judea. Some historians suggest he was exiled, while others indicate he may have been forced to commit suicide, a common end for disgraced Roman officials. The man who once held the power of life and death over others now faced his own grim fate, possibly reflecting on the decisions that led him to this point. Later Christian traditions elaborated narratives about Pilate's end. The 4th century historian Eusebius of Caesarea cites earlier writers claiming Pilate fell into such disgrace under Caligula that he committed suicide, becoming his own executioner. Other medieval legends place his death in the Swiss Alps, where a mountain near Lucerne still bears his name, Mount Pilatus. According to this tradition, his body was thrown into a mountain lake, causing storms and supernatural phenomena until it was finally exorcised in the 16th century. The contrast between Pilate's fate and Jesus could not be more striking. The man who condemned Jesus to death ended up condemned by history and tradition, while his victim rose again and inspired the greatest spiritual movement the world has ever known. This dramatic reversal reminds us that earthly power is temporary, while the consequences of our moral choices can echo for eternity. What we choose when we are at the height of our power defines who we truly are and often shapes our ultimate destiny. Pilate's case offers a fascinating window into the complex dynamics of the Roman Empire and its provincial administration. As prefect of Judea, Pilate held an intermediate position in the imperial hierarchy, powerful over the local inhabitants, but always accountable to his superiors in Rome. This precarious position created a constant dilemma: how to maintain the peace and order demanded by Rome while navigating the cultural and religious complexities of a notoriously difficult region. How many of us face similar dilemmas in our own lives, caught between conflicting expectations? Roman administration in eastern provinces like Judea was a delicate dance between imposition and accommodation. While Rome generally allowed conquered peoples to maintain their religious and cultural practices, there were limits to this tolerance, especially when local traditions seemed to threaten Roman stability or supremacy. Pilate exemplifies the tensions faced by colonial administrators throughout the empire, forced to balance respect for local sensitivities with the need to maintain imperial authority and collect taxes. Thus, Pilate's ultimate failure as governor did not stem from his decision about Jesus, but from his inability to maintain this delicate balance over time. His repeated miscalculations on Jewish religious issues, from introducing imperial images in Jerusalem to using temple funds for public projects, demonstrate a fundamental lack of cultural understanding that eventually sealed his fate. In an increasingly globalized world, his story reminds us of the critical importance of cultural intelligence and empathy for leaders at all levels. The tragic irony of Pilate's career is that his attempt to avoid trouble by condemning Jesus ended up being just a footnote in his political downfall, while it became the defining act of his life in world history. While his administration and achievements as governor have been largely forgotten, his name remains eternally linked to the trial of Jesus, mentioned in Christian creeds recited by billions over the centuries. This reality invites us to consider, for what actions do we want to be remembered? And are we prepared for the fact that our seemingly small decisions may become our most lasting legacy? Pilate's story serves as a powerful reminder that our decisions define not only our personal destiny, but also our legacy in history. His example challenges us to consider how we respond when facing our own moments of truth, and whether we have the moral courage to stand up for what is right, even when it comes with a personal cost. Pilate missed his opportunity to be on the right side of history, but you don't have to make the same mistake. Subscribe now to our channel to continue this journey of biblical discoveries that illuminate our understanding of the past and transform our view of the present. Each subscription helps us bring these powerful messages to more people who, like you, seek to understand the mysteries and truths of the Holy Scriptures. And if you were impacted by Pilate's tragic fate, you need to know what happened to those who chose the opposite path. In our video, The 12 Terrible Ends of the Apostles, How They Really Died, we reveal the surprising fates of those who, unlike Pilate, chose to follow Christ even knowing they would pay with their lives. Their stories of courage and unwavering faith will inspire you to stand firm in your own convictions. Click the card that appears now on the screen or the link in the description to discover how the apostles faced their own moments of truth with a courage that defies human understanding. The same choice that confronted Pilate and the apostles confronts us today. Follow the truth at any cost or give in to the world's pressure? What will your decision be? Until the next video, remember, the choices we make today echo in eternity.